Welcome to Musicians versus the World, the podcast where we explore aspects of music and musician life that may not have been covered in music school. I am your host, Christine Smith, and today we're going to continue on our path as we are learning about neurodiversity in the music world. Specifically, we are going to be learning about the different types of learning styles and reading styles when it comes to reading music. If you are a teacher and you want to help your students even more and to get over some sort of plateau with their note reading, there are going to be wonderful top tips and tricks and just a great outline of the different ways that students learn, so that can help you with your studio as well. And if you're a student, this is a fantastic episode for you to see, oh, I learn this way. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just a different way of learning, and here's something that I can do to improve my skills. So I'm so happy that you're here joining us today, and I am so excited to introduce my guest to you. We have Dr. Malena McLaren here with us, who's going to tell us some of the tips that she's been using in her studio for the past many years that have worked really well with her students, and some of the things that she's learned over the years about note reading and about the way that musicians learn how to read music. So I'm going to read her introduction for you so you can get to know her a little bit better before we hear from her. Dr. Malena McLaren is the professor of clarinet at Northwestern State University of Louisiana. She received the Bachelor in Music Education and Master of Music degree in clarinet performance at the University of New Mexico, and the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in clarinet performance with a minor in musicology at the University of North Texas. She has recorded with the University of New Mexico, She has recorded with the University of New Mexico Chamber Orchestra, the University of North Texas Wind Symphony, and has performed in orchestras throughout Mexico and the United Kingdom. As a member of the Trio de Llano, Malena has performed throughout the US, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, England, and Spain. She is also a core member of the Rapides Symphony Orchestra and has performed solo and chamber recitals at multiple international Clarinet Fest conferences. She is an international award-winning researcher and is currently serving as Louisiana State Chair for the International Clarinet Association. So, Dr. McLaren, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about this. I'm really excited to try and be helpful for students and teachers. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for agreeing to it. I have to say, you and I chatted a couple days ago, and you were telling me about some of these activities and these different scaffoldings that you do with your student. And I tried it out on one of my students on Wednesday.
Awesome.
And he's just this little guy. Oh my goodness.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Oh my goodness. It worked so well. And he had so much fun.
Yes.
And it was just, I am so happy to report that it worked well with my student. And I'm excited to share this with my learners.
I'm so happy to hear that, because it's worked so well for me. And the last thing I want to do is tell other people how to teach by any means. But I love to share and to have things shared with me over the years, as people have, that just to help us all help other people. So I'm really happy that you told me that. That makes me really, really glad.
Oh yeah. And I have a few more students. I'm going to be like, okay,
excellent.
we need to do this.
Yeah, keep me posted.
I will for sure. So you said you've used this with your students as well. So can you describe kind of the history of this and what you've noticed in your studio and why these tips and these structures have been so important?
Absolutely. Well, and I really kind of stumbled upon it because just being a typical, college student, I changed my major a couple times and found myself taking classes I thought were kind of irrelevant after I actually finished my degree in music ed. I had taken some extra classes I ended up not needing. But one of those was a linguistics class, which really fascinated me at the time, but I ended up not needing it for the music ed degree. But because it was so interesting when I took it, I remember just really kind of devouring the information, and then just figured, well, okay, I guess I don't need that anymore, and moved on. And then as I started teaching, I was noticing some issues in reading music that I wasn't sure how to approach. I wasn't sure how to help students. And it concerned me as a teacher. How am I going to help these kids? So what I went back to, and I will of course talk more about both of these things, but what I went back to is what I learned in this linguistics class about how our brain learns language and how we process information and in what order. And so, in a nutshell, that is, I just thought, let me try this. Let me see if this is going to help some of my students. And it really worked. And so the more I tried, it's kind of like my own like active experiment over years and years, So I each time would try something a little different, or kind of tweak it as I went, and was just really excited to see the results, and most importantly, to see the students feel like they were making progress. It was tangible for them, like something clicked or made sense. And so that was such positive feedback for me as a teacher. I just kept going with it and kind of went back to those. I'm certainly not a linguist by any means. I have a class is all. So I just took from that beginner linguistics class how our brain learns language, the things that I remembered about how we go from being able to speak and then being able to read the language, our native language. It takes a while for that to happen. We don't just start speaking the minute we hear the language. There's a lot of processes that need to happen in the brain. So that's really what kind of informed the sequencing that I did with my students and helping them read music better. And so that's kind of in a nutshell how all of that came about. I also found myself while at the University of North Texas, we all need to make money for rent. And so I was teaching lessons and I was teaching in a middle school. So I had a whole studio of beginners, which was fun on so many levels. I just loved teaching them, but it forced me to really go with fundamentals and teach them from scratch. And so having to do that for a year, and then once I got to teaching college, seeing some of the issues I was seeing in reading music, that connection was really made for me that they were missing some of those fundamental reading skills for whatever reason. So just trying to connect the dots for them and not making them feel like that there was something wrong with them, that they had missed out. It's no fault of their own. It just, for whatever reason, either didn't retain for them, didn't connect, or was actually missing. So it didn't matter what the case was. It was just that if we could solve it and help them, that's the important thing. So.
Yeah. And I think that's important, especially as they get to their older years when they're already in music school, that you don't want to feel like something's wrong with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they're so self-conscious anyway. We all are. Right. I mean, being a musician, you have to let your walls down to really play well. And that puts us in a really vulnerable position. And so we as teachers, I think, recognizing that responsibility, we have to be a safe space for students to do that, and then to honor that space by not making them feel that they're doing something wrong or something's wrong with the way that they're learning or trying to play. That's such you've got to be careful how you address those things. You can't just say, you can't read music. What's wrong with you? So, because they're trying. It's not that they were not trying. They just didn't have a way to do it. So, which just broke my heart for them. You could see the frustration. So I was just glad to be able to figure out some way to help,
Yeah. And that's so great that you have this different thing. Now, you said that there are two different types of readers. Do you want to explain a little bit about that? So fascinating.
Sure. So, this was actually completely trial and error. I was thinking, especially these first few students, I remember my first few years of teaching at the college level, how can I approach this with them? I noticed that they were either one or a combination of these things: getting lost in the music. So they would be playing, but would very easily get lost. Freezing. Wasn't that they didn't understand what was on the page, but they would just freeze, couldn't keep playing. They were getting a general contour of what was written, but not all the details in there, So, for example, if you have several measures of 16th notes with some interspersed 8th note passages, just reading them as if they were the same rhythm. Just those sorts of mistakes, transposing rhythms or transposing notes. Just those sorts of things. So I thought they're not seeing all of the details. So I remember asking one of the students, how do you read a book? Do you read quickly or do you read slowly? And this kind of started then this process of me figuring out, okay, I'm seeing students are falling into two categories: overreaders, or over skimmers. And I think not just students, all of us, if you think for yourself, I know I'm an over skimmer. I am the one who will read a book. I'll be reading and I've got to go back because I'm like 3 sentences ahead of where I've actually comprehended what I read. And so I catch myself definitely over skimming.
Oh, yeah.
Overreaders tend to really get in the word into each sentence and won't go on until they understand that sentence. And there's absolute value in both of those. I have yet to find a person who reads beautifully, perfectly, never has issues. I'm sure they're out there, but usually when I ask someone, they're like, oh, I'm an overreader for sure. I look at I'm an overskimmer. And then I tell the student, well, it relates. Let's think when you read music, do you read every single note? Are you really analyzing every note? Or are you kind of looking at the contour of a measure or a line or 2 measures? And they almost know immediately, oh yeah, I tend to do this. They're really clear on what their tendency is. And the first thing I tell them is, great, I do this. Here's my tendency. This is just a brain tendency. Nothing is wrong with either of us, with anybody. This is just our tendency of how we read. So then what I explain to them is once they've identified, oh, okay, I'm an overreader. That's what I tend to do. And I always say, I'm an overskimmer. So I will just kind of keep going. And then we can both kind of laugh about it and say, this is just great. Okay. And then I tell them the good news is the strategies to help us read music are exactly the same for both of us. So then I tell them, this is how this relates to music. If you took out all the spaces, just imagine a paragraph, take out all the spaces, capital letters, punctuation, all of that, you would still be able to read that paragraph because your brain knows those words and those patterns of letters, but it would be really exhausting because your brain is having to create the structure, the visual grammar, while it's also trying to comprehend what's there. And that's a lot to ask your brain to do. What our brain actually does when we are reading or learning the language is it has to understand that grammar before it can actually use the information. So this is why, and this is what I learned in my linguistics class, why, babies can understand what you're saying long before they can start to converse with you. Of course, there's muscle development that needs to happen, all of that. But this is why we get that really cute kind of toddler language of, mixing up words or mixing up the pronoun, this is she ball or this is he cookie or, things like that. Their brain is figuring out which, the rules of the language, the grammar, the structure. And if you're looking at music, it's also a language. I think we all can kind of agree on that. There's a grammar and a structure to music, to looking at and reading music. So I try and make the relationship for them that these are musical words. It's an alphabet, it's letters, it's patterns. So think of them as words versus just a bunch of notes that you're putting together. So if you can give your brain the structure and the grammar that it needs to be able to then comprehend what's there, you've removed a really big obstacle. So I think them understanding, okay, yeah, and this is not necessarily difficult. It's just knowing that you need to do it. So, so I kind of make that relationship for them. And then I tell them if, whether you're an overreader or an overskimmer, you are removing the grammar, whether it's just seeing a whole lot or you're just seeing one letter at a time, the structure is missing.
Right. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say that kind of sets the stage for then what we do to help them.
Yeah. Yeah. So to kind of recap, so the overskimmers are the ones that are just kind of way ahead, and sometimes they'll miss the details and things like that.
Right. They'll read the contour. They'll kind of get the contour of the phrase, and probably
maybe make
rush.
Up their own rhythm.
Right. Yeah, and probably rush. Not always, but tend to be. Overreaders can definitely rush too because they just give up, and they tend to freeze a little more often because they just get really stuck in a word. But I'm a big rusher. I have to really watch myself because that's just my tendency. So I think overskimmers have a tendency to really rush, finish a phrase even 3-4 beats ahead of time.
Yeah. And then, so then the overreaders are like reading note by note by note, and that's where the pauses come in and all of those.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So there's no context for it. They just see the notes. The minute there's something that their brain has to think about, they usually freeze or they just start making stuff up, which again, I was telling them, it's okay. Your brain is wired to go to the path of least resistance. And sometimes that means guessing. Like, you have to keep going. And your brain's like, I just got to keep going. So it just kind of goes and guesses. But then they eventually just kind of freeze and stop. Don't really know where they are, what beat they're on. They're just kind of panicking, moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that makes total sense. So your first step is to figure out where they are and help them to realize, okay, there's nothing wrong with you. Here are some things that can help
Yeah.
improve
And
your
I
reading.
try and make some funny like analogies and references to like that reading one is great because they can all picture a paragraph and taking out all spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And, just kind of make it very light. And it's just not a serious issue. This is just what it would be like. And think about how exhausting that would be,
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then what's the next step? Because these are all strategies and it's like a scaffolding,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So then what happens after you like have figured out what is going on?
Yes. Okay. So depending on the level of the student, the basic understanding of the grammar needs to be there. In my situation, it always is because they're at the college level and have some level of playing experience through middle school and high school. So rhythm, understanding quarter note, half note, eighth note, 16th note, those sorts of things, and that they can read the notes. We're not still working on actually naming the notes. So you can, I think, still do this with beginners. It would just be within their ability of reading skill that way. But once that is set, then I tell them the first thing we've got to do is get the spaces between your words, between your musical words. And I show them, so in publishing music, the way we write music, even handwriting music, we have a grammar in there. We've got bars that put the eighth notes together or the 16th notes together. The way the quarter notes look, we've got a time signature. The grammar is set up. Your eyes are just not seeing it because of the tendency you have in your reading. And I always go back to myself. So, for example, my tendency is to erase all bar lines, forget about how the 16th notes are barred together. I just want to keep going so that they can relate to, okay, well, my tendency is the same, or I tend to just forget all bar lines because I'm looking at every note,
Yeah.
So then I have them put in what I call beat marks, which I tell them this has nothing to do with knowing where the beat is. You know that. This is not about your intellectual understanding of where the beats are, but it's a visual cue. It's the spaces in your sentence. So it's the spaces between the words. And it's literally just a straight line over the first note in that beat, which can either be, group of 16ths, or if it's a half note, you put 2 lines over it spaced appropriately. So you have to be careful in spacing these beat marks that it actually looks equally spaced as much as possible where appropriate and I'll and once you do it, you'll see exactly what I mean. It's pretty straightforward. So I explained to them they're putting the spaces in. This is very easy for us to understand, but understanding what you're doing, the intellectual understanding and the application of it are 2 very different skills. So I always tell them, give yourself grace and be patient with your brain. Let it get this pathway made, and it will take some repetition. So don't think you're doing something wrong or there's something wrong with you if you don't get it right away. But just let yourself do it. Then I have them just say or sing the rhythm while they're either with their pencil or their finger pointing to that line. It's like a bouncing ball experiment. We've all seen those. You're just watching.
Yeah.
What that does, and I explain this to them, is we got to train your visual cues. Your eyes are either not going to the next space or they're ignoring the space and just moving on. So we have to train our eyes to meet at every visual cue so you see the beginning of each word. This is what we do when we read, and our brain then recognizes the pattern by what's at the beginning. And your brain can really quickly see those patterns. But if you don't look at the beginning of the word, you're not giving it a chance to recognize that pattern. So I kind of make a joke like you've got to meet every beat. Like you have to visually, your brain and your eyes have to go to that beat. You say hello, shake its hand. How are you today? How's your mom and them? Is everything good? Okay, wonderful. The other ones that you're just passing by, you know them. They're people, they're your friends, but you're going to say hello to, hey, how's it going? Nice to see you.
Gotcha.
Oh, and you too. So they kind of it's a funny way for them to get the visual of, no, I mean, meet that beat. Don't just look at it, meet it. Hello, how are you? Eye contact. And so we always usually have a little chuckle about that, but then they understand how important it is for their brain and their eyes to meet at that next beat. So of course we're going quite slow and a small chunk, a measure at a time, 2 measures at a time. But no playing. We are just saying the rhythm, pointing to help your eyes. So I always tell them we're practicing the visual cue. You're going to get the notes. I'm not worried. Your brain will tell your fingers what to do and it will work every time. But if your brain has nothing to tell your fingers, that's why you can't play it because there's no information going there.
Yeah.
And your brain can't tell your fingers anything if it doesn't have the musical word ready to go. So it can tell you the whole word, but you got to let it see it. Then when they can do that and they feel confident that their visual cue is happening, then I'll have them do the same thing, but fingering on their instrument, whatever it is. No playing yet, but still just singing it, putting the notes in, but really making sure their visual cue is staying. And I always go back to that. Are your eyes meeting each beat? Can you feel the visual cues happening? And by this point, they're usually, nope, not happening. Great, let's just stay in that. Go back one step and do it until that's happening. Or they know, yeah, oh my goodness, yes, okay, I'm seeing that. I see that. Great. When they can finger through and sing it, then we play it, because now you're not asking your brain to do all that at once. Your brain can now send the signals to your fingers. Again, quite slowly, I tell them, do it. Who cares what the tempo is? Just make it easy. So it's very easy for your brain. The tempo will be there when you need it once you have this organization ready to go. So then when they feel a little success in that one measure or those two measures, they're really, I have found, at least in my experience, they're excited to go ahead and put their beat marks in everywhere else. We try the next two measures, and then I set up an assignment for the next week. And then I do tell them also, now don't worry, your music will not have little lines all over it for the rest of your life. What you're showing your brain is this skill, this reading skill, that you can use in places where the patterns or the rhythms are not comfortable or not familiar to you. So you can use this skill. Pretty soon, though, your brain's going to do this. It's going to thank you for giving it the grammar and the structure, and you won't need to put those visual cues in. Your brain will just see them. But you've now got a tool that where your brain is not seeing them, you know exactly what to do. Why am I messing up these three measures? Okay, go back to the signals aren't being sent. Let's go back to square one. Put your beat marks in, point, make sure your visual cues are there, finger through, make sure your visual cues are staying put. Now try and play it. Once it's there, you've got it. The added benefit then they see is, if you are making a rhythm or any sort of mistake, rhythm or technique, you know exactly which beat it's happening in, which musical word. So you can isolate mistakes very quickly, fix just the mistake, not just play the same phrase over and over and hope it gets better.
Right. So it makes practicing much more efficient.
Much more efficient, exactly. And then I tell them the extra added bonus is when you're performing, we all have some level of performance anxiety, I think, but especially students, this is just new to them. Really, the issue that creates that fear is that you don't know what you're going to do if you mess up. Well, if you have a system in place that when you make a mistake, you can recover within one or two beats, the fear goes away. You may still, you're going to have the adrenaline, of course. We all do. That's why we do music. But it will become excitement or anticipation versus fear, which is a very different experience. Nobody wants to be afraid to play. But if you know you can recover, then mistakes are no longer like falling off a cliff, and in our brains sometimes, that's a different discussion of the performance anxiety, but in our brains, we can't really make that differentiation sometimes. It can really feel really frightening when we don't know how we'll recover from something. So, so that's kind of the sequencing. And of course, each student is different. So I'll spend a lot more time in one area of that sequencing with another. But it's really great to see the excitement when they start to see not only the improvement, but that they are now empowered. They have a way to help themselves rather than just bringing it to me.
Oh, yeah. It makes them independent, and then they can go on to the next part. So why do you think that being able to read music is important for musicians?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, of course, we've got our oral training, our being able to play by ear, of course, super important. Yes. But the reading skill, I think when I went through school and I was training very much for a sort of studio sort of thing, pit orchestra sort of thing. So I doubled on the woodwinds and really was training to do sight reading. So, this is why it was a little bit strange to me as I started to teach, is that this was not in my realm of, this is a problem I have come across for whatever reason. I kind of knew how to do this, thankfully. I'm sure it's because of the wonderful teachers I had that I was set up for that, which is great. But that's just my experience. That doesn't have to be everybody's experience. So it really forced me in seeing this issue to just really deconstruct it and figure out, how does one teach this? I didn't have to do this at this time. So how do I teach this to students? And so, but I think it made my reading a lot better too, because I saw my tendency and how to do it. But I think, I've got students who want to do that sort of thing. They want to be able to take gigs. They want to be able to play professionally in that way. Of course, sight reading skills are crucial when that happens, but also just their auditioning and their ensemble playing and their being able to play the repertoire and truly enjoy it. I think if the reading skill is strong, and not only the reading, but then the recovery skill is strong, it makes a completely different experience for them. So I kind of equate it to them like a very eloquent public speaker. Those, can just be really moving. And I'm sure we can all instantly think of an example for us, our own personal lives, that we've really been moved by a public speaker somehow. And it's a similar thing. We can all read, but not all of us can speak publicly that eloquently, and so I think if this trains you as a musician to speak through your instrument more eloquently and more comfortably, the experience is really much more, you're really experiencing the music rather than panicking about reading it. So, or you can just enjoy more. You can read a book more comfortably, all that sort of stuff. Same with music. You learn music so much faster because it's just like you're reading words you already know versus having to relearn each of these words, each of these notes every time. It's not a puzzle you're solving every time. So, yeah. And then it's so fun to see just the enjoyment for them when they get through a piece and they actually experienced it instead of just like, oh gosh, get me through this. Then, it's just, that's the most rewarding part for me to see that for them. And it happens on different levels. Some students are just going to get it faster and understand it. And some are going to get it just enough to be able to get through their jury or to get through their, piece they have to play in public, and that's okay.
And that's great.
That is fine. Exactly. That is perfectly fine.
That is great. So how do you approach a student with this? Like that first time you notice something's off with their sight reading or their rhythm's a little bit off. How do you approach your student without, making them feel bad?
Right. Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that because we have to be so careful. And this is where our responsibility as a teacher comes in. I am very careful not to just say, you're doing this wrong or what's happening there? What's wrong? They know they're doing it wrong. They don't want to do it wrong. They want to do it better. I usually start with a question and I let them keep going because for me, it helps them. So for a larger chunk, I don't stop them right away. So I have a little more data to decide, what do I think is happening? Do I think they're an overreader or an overskimmer? So I kind of have an idea of how I'm going to approach it, but I let them play I don't torture them. I let them keep going. If they're really struggling, we stop, but I let them finish out a section. And then I ask a question. So, tell me what's happening in your brain as you're reading that. How are you seeing this line? Or just tell me what's happening. And then usually my experience is they've been pretty open with, gosh, I'm freezing. I'm getting stuck right here. And I'll usually follow because by then I've made my own assessment. I think they're an overreader. Let's say this person's an overreader and I notice they're freezing a lot or really just have a lot of tension. It looks like they're really laboring through it. So sometimes they'll just say, I don't know. I just can't. I can't play because they really don't know what's happening. So then I'll kind of ask leading questions of, do you feel like your brain just stops? Like it doesn't want to read anymore? Do you feel like your brain's having to choose between guessing and playing? And then usually, just trying to help them put words to what they're experiencing. Do you feel, is it really frustrating? Are you frustrated at this point? What's happening to your brain? Are your eyes getting stuck or are you just skipping ahead over here? Or when you read this measure and you're looking at this note, what's the next note you land on? Those sorts of questions just to really isolate and get them to start seeing, oh, well, I don't think I'm landing on any notes. Okay, great. Let's see if sometimes I'll do it just for 3 beats. Can you just play and I put the beat marks in. Can you just play these 3 notes? Let's say it's 3 sets of 3 beats of 16th notes, that sort of thing. I'll just kind of really break it down so they start to understand what's happening, what their brain's doing. Then I'll go into like, oh, yeah, I've seen this happens for, a lot of people. And I always put my experience in. You know what my brain does? I have a tendency to just skip over four beats and I just want to look at the end of the phrase, and I just try and make it light and like, oh, yeah, all of us have a tendency to do one of these things. What's your tendency? Which group are you in and then I always tell them, we can fix that. I can help you fix that. So let's figure out what your brain's doing so I can help you. And then by then they've usually opened up and they're just relieved that there's nothing wrong with them or, and then sometimes they'll come back a few lessons later and say, I'm really frustrated. I didn't know this already. Or why has no one shown me this? And I always tell them, no, this it doesn't matter. Like, that's okay. Like when you're in an ensemble setting, one person can't hear everybody's tendency. So nobody taught you poorly or wrong or anything. You just haven't come across this experience where we get to break it down. That's the beauty of lessons, and we're going to break it down.
Yes.
But it's nobody's fault. Yeah. You didn't do anything wrong. Nobody did anything wrong. It's just that when you're in a large group, you can't hear everybody at once. Nobody could.
Right. Right.
So we all cope as we can. Some people become really great at playing by ear as their way of dealing with it. And what a great skill, Oh, yeah. My ear is not nearly strong. I'm a much stronger reader. And that maybe is because I really had to work hard at developing my ear. I was not one of those musicians that came easily for me. And so in music school, that was how I would spend lots of time on my oral skills homework, and that's okay. And I didn't play piano at all. Like, those were skills I really had to learn. So my reading skills maybe are strong because of that. Maybe that was why I could read well. So, but then I've had students who, if I sang it to them once, it's done. They can memorize the whole thing. That's amazing to me. And I always point out what they do well. Like, that is unbelievable that you can do that. Let's put both of these skills together and you'll be unstoppable. And that's amazing.
Right. You'd be able to do anything.
Yes. Yeah. So, I just try and show them we're just adding this to what you already do well. You don't necessarily do anything that's holding you back. Let's just keep adding skills to what you do well. And now we found something that we can work on. Let's work on this together. So just always trying to empower them to realize, because at the end of the day, oh man, we're musicians for so many reasons, and not really to become famous or to do, it's great if that happens to some people, but it's such a wonderful addition to, regardless of our profession. If we have that in our lives, I think it just makes us more human, so it's, if they can leave me and go be the doctor, lawyer, whatever they're doing, and still appreciate music and be able to pick it up as they keep going, that's fantastic.
Right. And this is just another tool that helps them be independent so that they can do that for their entire lives.
Exactly. Yeah. My job is to make sure they don't need me,
Right.
Which is great. And then I can just be friends with them. I always tell them, I can't wait till we can just be friends and go have coffee. Right now I got to be your teacher. So we're going to learn stuff, but when you're out there, come visit me. We'll go have coffee.
Yeah. I love that. I love that relationship that you keep. Yeah. And I think that helps, create that environment that you were talking about it being a safe place and helping them with their problems and not really framing it as a problem. Exactly, it's just like expanding their toolbox.
Yeah, exactly. And recognizing that our brains all do things a little differently. And that's actually a great thing. That's really cool. Because then we can all help each other. So it's recognizing what your brain does and then working with it.
Yeah. So I love that.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing this. And like I said, I did this with a student and it was just amazing. And how, and how just happy he was and how motivated he was to, like, he'd been working on this section for so long. And we just took a step back and we laughed together and we just had a really great time. So I hope other people listen to this and either use it for themselves or for their students and just really take advantage of this great advice that you're giving.
Oh, me too. And I would love to hear from anybody that tries it and has some, just to share in the, yes, awesome, high five club about it,
I love that. And now just to end up, just to finish up, I know you've given lots of advice, but what sort of general advice, like one more piece of advice that you have for anyone wanting to be a musician, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think, the first thing that comes to mind is to just let go of the expectation of perfection. I know I started as a musician really trying to make everything perfect. I really wanted to go take auditions and be out there, just to, like, in either pit orchestras or an orchestra or something. That'll wear you out real fast. And so I think realizing music is not about perfection. In fact, there's a quote, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who said this, but one of my favorite quotes. It's, the artistry is in the recovery. And that is just beautiful to me because, that's just kind of a metaphor for life, right? Rarely does something go as planned. But I think if we can just release that expectation that it needs to be perfect, of course we want to do it well and correctly, but that within that framework, there's a lot of room for each of us to have our own voice. That would be my advice. And be open to anything and any experience, because we can make a great career as a musician if we're open. If we narrow ourselves, we can really frustrate that process very quickly. So just be open, be kind, meet everybody, be, and with an open heart, and then just enjoy it. What a great gift to be a musician. Really, really great.
It is. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
And you're wonderful. Thank you. Of course. Thank you so much for being here.
No, my goodness. You're so nice. No, this was wonderful. What a great, I could, as you know, we talked on the phone, I could have this conversation for many, many hours. So thank you for helping me narrow it down. It's fascinating to me how the brain processes this stuff. And I think something I'll continue to study it, and maybe a little more formally once I have time. We're all laughing out loud at that one, but maybe down the road. So.
Well, we'll have you back after you do, once you get time.
Yeah, and I'll see you when I'm 80. So.
We'll definitely have you back and have you tell us all about this more research. And if you come up with any more great tips like this, please.
Absolutely.
come and share them.
I'm happy to. And I'm so glad to have met you. So I'm sure we'll stay connected. Like I always tell my students, you're stuck with me once you enter my world, you're stuck with me.
Same.
So. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
Good.
I'm the same way. So, Dr. Malena McLaren, thank you so much for being here, and just thanks so much.
Absolutely. So glad I could be here.